Good afternoon to our CLA family members, clients, community partners, and friends. Welcome back to our live stream. We sincerely hope that all of you are staying safe and healthy at this time. We have several special guests today to start unpacking our post-election world. First, I'd like to welcome back Chris Donraj from our Wealth Advisory team, who's going to be discussing the market's reaction to the post-election events. So welcome back, Chris.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We also have Chastity Wilson from our National Tax Office, and she's going to start addressing tax implications of the post-election world and its potential impacts on year-end planning. So great to have you, Chastity.
It's great to be here, Leslie.
And then we have Rick Kruger with our National Assurance Group. He's also on our Economic Relief team, and he is going to be addressing many of the latest and greatest updates we have on the PPP economic relief. So welcome, Rick.
Oh, thanks, Leslie.
So before we dive in today, we do have some housekeeping that we wanted to cover. Again, as with prior weeks, we do have the ability for live Q&A during our session today. In order to participate, you do need to register and log in using the link below me. Those questions are going to appear for you in the audience, and you are able to like those and actually move those up in priority so that we can address them. That's pretty exciting. And we do have moderators that are available and standing by ready to engage and interact with you. Additionally, I know this week has felt like a whirlwind for many of you. And as we settle into life post-election, we know that there are going to be so many questions and that you want to be thoughtful about how your actions over the coming weeks will affect your year-end planning. So we're going to address some of the high points today, but we know that there's going to be a ton of ground to cover in the coming weeks, and we have several webinars that we want you to know about to address that. First of all, next week on November 17th, we're going to have a year-end planning webinar that's focused on high net wealth individuals, wealth advisory, and we're going to have some updates there. On December 3rd, we're going to have a post-election webinar that's focused on tax and economic relief updates. And then finally, on December 10th, we'll also have a webinar that's going to be focused on tariff, trade, and other economic impacts of the election. So lots of fantastic stuff coming up. We have your back. You can register for all of those on our website. And in addition to all of these fantastic events, we're going to have lots of articles, other white papers coming out to provide additional information. But as always, please contact your CLA relationship. We want to talk to you about these things. So with that housekeeping, I want to kick off today with Chris. He was here with us last week, talked a little bit about the capital markets response. Last week, we had a lot of uncertainty. Chris, this week we have a little bit more political certainty with the anticipation that President Biden will be the next president. So in light of this, can you comment on how the capital markets have reacted?
Well, thank you, Leslie. And it's a great question. And I think with all the excitement we've had in the past week, you would think that the markets would have had a big move in one direction or another. But what's really interesting is that the headline level, right at the top level of the market, whether you look at the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, or other major indices, there really hasn't been much change. All right, the S&P 500, is only up or down a few points since last Friday, when we really did not have the clarity that President Biden would be the presumed president-elect. Really, the change has been at the industry level, at the sector level. And so you've seen some of the larger tech stocks sell off, and you've seen some of the COVID response, in terms of vaccines and other types of progress made, affecting healthcare stocks, which have gone higher, and also affecting stocks such as airlines, which have moved 10% up on the week. And so it's been more of an industry rotation at the lower levels. And then in fixed income, you've actually seen something quite interesting, which is fixed income yields have moved somewhat higher. something like 10 or 12 basis point higher, depending on the market. And really, that's an assessment by the market that there will be more fiscal spending, right? We had the federal budget deficit numbers showing that the government spend had a $3.1 trillion deficit for this past year ending in October. And that's up from about 980 billion in the prior year. And of course, that's driven by fiscal spending to support the economy post COVID. And so you really have to look underneath the hood to kind of see some real change here.
Those are some really fascinating insights. And so I know Chastity is going to go into a lot of detail just on the tax platform under a Biden regime, but I would be interested in your perspective on what to watch out for during this year end from an investment perspective, also weighing in on any tax impacts of that.
Yep, and I think this is a really interesting comment as we head into year end, because yes, we have a really interesting year end related to elections, but it's also the typical season where clients look at their portfolios. They look at tax loss harvesting strategies. They look at taking gains. And in some ways, this is just like any other year, right? Clients are looking at their portfolios and they're seeing certain technology stocks up, 100%, 200% or more. And so it makes sense that in the absence of any news, they're still going with the muscle memory of taking profits. There are other areas which are longer term trends that investors are looking at. And so areas like opportunity zones, areas like healthcare or technology are areas that are being analyzed for longer term trends. But at the end, the core question and the core point still remains, Leslie, which is that in the absence of any new information about policy changes, about tax rate changes, investors are just doing, some portfolio activities that are typical for year end, which is taking money off the table for those that have run up quite a bit.
Well, I really appreciate all of those comments. We're going to keep you around here because I know we have questions coming in Slido, and your comments are a really good segue to Chastity to talk about taxes in a post-election world. So Chastity, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Leslie. Such an interesting topic and obviously very timely. So glad to be here to talk about this.
Yeah, so Chastity, we have a lot of clients that are wondering, with the apparent Biden victory, if we can expect tax reform in 2021, and if there's any swift planning moves that they should plan to make during this year end. So I'm curious what perspectives, if any, you can provide on that topic.
Yeah, thanks. That's a loaded question, Leslie. So yeah, I think where we need to start though, Leslie, is we have an apparent Biden president, right? It looks like President Biden will likely be president, but we have to take this one layer deeper because we're talking about tax law, right? And so we have to understand, how is tax law made? Because in order to raise rates, for example, that's a hot topic. Leslie, I know you got a lot of calls from your clients this week, right?
Yeah.
So are my rates going to go up in 2021, right? So, but what has to happen in order for that to happen is law. There has to be a bill passed, and that takes the Senate and the House. And so quite honestly, the race I've been watching the closest is the Senate. So right now, the House, it hasn't been called officially, but it appears as though the Democrats will remain control in the House. And then the Senate. Talk about the nail biter. We know there's gonna be a runoff. So right now, what's been called, I believe, what we're all predicting is, we have 100. Right now, the Republicans are at 50, but we have a runoff in Georgia. So Georgia has this system where if it's real close, they have a runoff election, which will be in January. So we're really not going to know the control of the Senate until January. And that can make a huge difference, because if both those seats go Democratic, that means we have a 50-50 split, and any tie would be decided by vice president. So why am I giving you this whole civil law background is because in order for tax law to take place in 2021, it starts in the House, which is Democratic, then it goes to Senate, which is Republican. And I've been around for a while, and it's usually pretty difficult to get major tax legislation through when you have a split in the House and the Senate. And so we are not expecting, if the Republicans remain control in the Senate, we're not expecting any significant changes in the tax law, but that's a prediction and that's all that can be, right?
Right.
But that's why it's critical to look at the Senate and where that stands and what is our Congress going to look like.
Absolutely. That's a great insight. So, I think now that we do have an apparent Biden victory, there's some other questions that viewers and clients might have just in understanding what could be on the horizon under a Biden regime. And I'd be curious what thoughts and comments you might be willing to shed in light of that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And what we have is kind of what was released during the campaign, right? That's what we have to go off of, foreshadowing what may come, under the president's plan. And so we do know that Biden talked about raising the rate on corporations to 28%. That's significant, right? Mm-hmm. What we know, though, going back to my comment, I'm going to bring it back to the Senate. What we're hearing, and again, this is all prediction, right, at this point, but what we're hearing is where the deficit is overall, Republicans even might be motivated to get some type of rate increase. So you may see something like McConnell saying, okay, Republicans will buy in, not at 28, but something more like 24, 26%.
Sure.
So we need to watch that, right? The corporate rates. And then I'm going to jump forward. Well, what does that mean to me individually? Under Biden's plan, there was talk of restoring back up to the what was what we call TCJA, reinstating the highest rate for individuals. But we have to be mindful about that because Biden was very clear that that would apply to those earning $400,000 or more. So he's really targeting the top earners. But Leslie, we're tax people, right? And we immediately, what do we ask? What does $400,000 mean? Is that taxable income? Is that gross income? We don't know what that means, but we do know that Biden's looking at kind of, under his plan would increase that top rate on individuals earning more than $400,000.
Sure.
The other thing we real quick, like Leslie, because I know you have a great speaker coming up behind me, so I could easily dominate this whole conversation because I'm passionate about it. But, we got to think about that tax reform bill I talked about, TCJA, that was passed. Mm-hmm. It had a lot of provisions because of the way it was passed that expire in 2025. So What does this all mean for those expiring provisions? Like, a lot of our clients, 199 Cap A. What does that mean? That's set to expire in 2025. So what does that mean under this new, what we are looking at today with Biden potentially as president, a Republican-controlled Senate maybe, and a Democratic House? What does that all mean? We don't know, Leslie, because that's 2 years, and we're going to have another election before that. And so we can't predict what's going to happen in the Senate or the House. What I would say, Leslie, is, it's definitely part of the tax planning. We'd be naive to say our clients that we serve and our audience aren't worried about that. But right now, we have to stay calm and don't make rash decisions. And one of the things I want to highlight, one of my colleagues that I go to for a lot of information, Chris Hesse, he says it well. He said, sometimes you can make elections on your 2020 return that allow you to increase income, because the thought is maybe I want to increase my income in 2020 because the rates will be lower than potentially what they could be in 2021. Sometimes you can do that through elections you make on your timely filed return, which means you're making that decision in 2021. You're pushing that all the way out to the fall. That might be what you want to do, right? Because then we'll have a better sense of what maybe tax legislation could get passed, if any.
Yeah, I think those are wonderful insights. There is certainly just a lot to watch, a lot to think about over these coming months. I certainly really encourage everybody to meet with your tax advisor, have that year-end planning connection. We are going to continue to monitor the evolution of all of this and keep you posted as things change. But certainly, Chastity, what you've said, I have reiterated to many, and that is to really stay calm here. Let's make calculated decisions and make them considering the whole here. So we really appreciate your insights. We are going to keep you around for questions. I know we've seen some coming through Slido. And with that now, I would like to bring in Rick, because in addition to all of this election chaos that we have had, it's amazing that we've actually had quite a bit of developments as well around PPP and the economic relief. So Rick, welcome back today. It is fantastic to have you.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie.
I would like to start today where Matthew left off last week. So last week, he introduced the brand new SBA Forms 3509 and 3510. And we have been hearing a lot from clients who are receiving these forms and frankly have concerns. So question is, have we learned anything more? And do we have any suggestions for borrowers who have been receiving these forms?
It's a fantastic question. And so where you and Chastity mentioned that you've been getting lots of calls lately about the election, my phone is still ringing from Form 3509 and 3510. And as a reminder to everybody about what these are in the first place, these are the loan necessity questionnaires generally for loans at least $2 million, including affiliate loans. There's one form, the 3509, which is for for-profits. The other form is for nonprofits. If you haven't seen a copy, if you don't know what I'm referring to yet, I wouldn't get overly concerned about that. This isn't something you need to go out and proactively seek and complete it. It's something that your lender is going to send to you, but it is good to think about it in advance, prepare for it, because if and when you do receive one from your lender, you have 10 business days to respond to it. As far as the form itself and what we know here, I'll admit it's a little intense when you first open it up. There's 7 to 8 pages worth of questions. However, for most borrowers, the message we've been trying to convey is really don't panic, similar to what Chastity said. Don't panic, take a pause, take a breath. We always knew that documentation was going to be really important, especially for the loans over $2 million. And the general structure really is the same as what SBA provided us back 6 months ago in FAQ 31. As far as how to fill it out, there's really minimal instructions, and even the lenders, if you get them talking informally, will tell you they're quite confused about a lot of the details on here. But I'll share a few tips that we've been picking up as we talk to more borrowers, more lenders, and more advisors out there. The first tip, and this might sound really obvious, but I think it's important to remember and keep front of mind, is answer the form truthfully. It's really easy to panic when you see the questions and some of the details and the topics, and you might worry that a specific question could disqualify you from the loan or forgiveness. But remember, the SBA has explicitly said in the instructions that they're going to base any determination on the totality of your circumstances.
Sure.
So as I heard an attorney say recently, avoid the temptation to try to provide obscure answers, defensive answers, evasive answers. Really try to go at this in a reasonable approach. The second tip, though, is that the forms do give you a lot of opportunities to really tell your story in a proactive way to the SBA. So use those to your advantage. The objective of PPP, the program itself, was keeping people working and maintaining their paychecks. So assuming that's how you use the funds, this is your opportunity to very clearly state that to the SBA. So make sure that they know how the funds benefited workers and not owners. Use those comment sections on the forms as your chance to proactively spread that message. And last tip is get ready now. That even though you don't need to be sending this into your lender unless they're asking, you should be getting ready if you do have a loan over $2 million so that you can meet that tight deadline.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. If you know that it's going to be coming and you know there's a quick turnaround, then be ready for that. So those are really fantastic updates. We have been talking all episode about year-end planning, whether it is with respect to your investments and the interplay of that with the election, whether it's respect to putting a bow on your tax planning and the interplay of all of that with the CARES Act and now the election. But in addition to that, we now also have to think about what borrowers should be thinking about from a PPP perspective when it comes to planning and timing issues. So what can you say about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely a lot of things we're trying to juggle in some of these year-end planning conversations, far more so than we have in the past. So a couple of things that come to mind as we think planning opportunities and timing. And I'm just going to start on some of the planning aspect and ignore timing for just a second here. There's one topic that we're hearing quite frequently, and this affects really a lot of our borrowers across many industries, just in slightly different ways, but it's really the same general topic. And as a little background on where the situation comes from, when they expanded the PPP time period from 8 weeks to 24 weeks, we're seeing a pretty large number of applications are being filled out with expenses with eligible costs for PPP that are maybe 2 to 3 times what you would need for full forgiveness. And within those eligible costs, there might be items that would normally be used for other programs. For example, you might have payroll costs that are eligible both for PPP and for federal grants, or PPP and in parts of healthcare where you have cost-based reimbursement, or PPP and certain tax credits for for-profit entities. With many of those programs, there are restrictions to keep in mind that would prevent you from double dipping or receiving a benefit twice for the same dollar amount under these different programs. So going back to where I started with PPP spending far exceeding the amount that you may need for full forgiveness, there might be an opportunity when we plan what costs go into the PPP forgiveness application. The major challenge, though, is that regulators are still actively deciding what the rules are for all of these programs. But it's certainly an opportunity when we think planning here before you finalize anything to think about the complexity, even with this moving target, understand what we know, what we don't know, and what flexibility we might have so that you don't lose an opportunity. The other big thing that we're hearing as these 24-week periods wrap up is the timing, and this does have some interplay with tax planning and other planning as well, is when does a borrower want to apply for PPP forgiveness?
Sure.
There's definitely not a one-size-fits-all answer for this, but I'll list out a few criteria or a few maybe considerations that we think through as we talk through some of these year-end planning things. One, I said moving target. That's especially true with PPP. We continue to get guidance now that we should have had 8 months ago. And some of that is positive guidance, some of it's negative guidance. I don't know if there's a right answer of whether or not you should wait or put a stake in the ground now, but that's certainly a consideration when we think about this. Distributions is another one. There aren't explicit restrictions for PPP when it comes to distributions, but there might be some things that if you are making distributions, the SBA may look at that negatively and say, if you can pay owners, did you actually need the funds for PPP in the first place? So something to consider, maybe not get overly worked up about, but to consider as you're planning when you want to apply. Expected changes in ownership is a really big deal. You need to do some planning if you have a PPP loan that hasn't been forgiven yet and you have a pending transaction. Loan covenant compliance, we're seeing lots of borrowers think ahead to maybe a 1231 compliance requirement and other debt, how PPP affects that, and tax planning. I'm sure this is coming up in lots of conversations with you, Leslie, and Chastity.
Every single one.
I wish we had some more certainty around this, and we're certainly hearing different rumors out there about what Treasury may or may not be doing with some of this, but it's definitely worth a conversation with your advisor about how the timing of PPP forgiveness may impact when you can or cannot deduct expenses related to PPP.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points, Rick. And so, we've talked a lot about PPP and year-end funding. In addition to PPP, there have been other COVID funding grants just more generally and broadly. And I do think there are a lot of organizations that have received new loans and new grants this year. And you've touched a little bit on perhaps the interplay of those. So what else should recipients keep in mind as they plan for year end and think about that?
I think that's a great question, and that's another one we're seeing come up more and more as we're getting deeper into conversations with clients, that there's a lot of surprises that are appearing at this time of year, and I think there's going to be a lot more surprises as people get deeper into it. Thinking back both on the government side and on the organizational side, we rewind back to March. The priority for everything was speed over details, speed over rules. Organizations were pushing out these programs and funding before they had written clear rules. We still don't have clear rules in a lot of situations. Organizations were signing up for these programs without really reading the fine print. And now as we get into some of that fine print, there are things that organizations are discovering that I think are worth mentioning now. Better to discover it now than 2 months from now when maybe you have some sort of deadline or even bigger issue. So I'll just mention a few to scratch the surface, but really the theme with all this is, if you haven't already, now is the time to dig in, to understand some of the rules and lean on some of your service providers to really help you along the way. A few things that we're seeing: federal funds, the number of federal COVID programs, there's over 20 new federal COVID programs, and plus existing programs, plenty of new grant funding that has gone through those programs. So there are a lot of organizations that are receiving new funding or increased funding that's pushing them over some pretty critical limits, whether that's for compliance requirements that they need to take on, new audit requirements or single audit requirements that are much more complex than what they've had to deal with in the past. So that's definitely been one source of maybe pain and continued pain into the future here. And then with these loan programs, both PPP and the SBA's EIDL, the Emergency Injury Disaster Loan Program, there's definitely some fine print to pay attention to. We talk a lot about PPP, so I'll maybe just mention the EIDL. There are some big restrictions that a lot of individuals didn't notice when they signed the agreements. All distributions require prior written consent from SBA if you have an outstanding EIDL loan. Those loans over $25,000 have collateral with further restrictions that can affect your other secured loans, that can affect any selling of collateral, and basically all tangible and intangible personal property is collateral for EIDL if you have a loan over $25,000. And if that's not enough, EIDL is also potentially subject to single audit, though usually not if that's your only source of federal funding. So, there's lots of things like that organizations are just beginning to dig into the details because it simply wasn't a priority when we needed to make sure we were in surviving. Long story short, now's definitely a good time to chat with folks and dig into that.
Yeah, and if you don't have a CLA relationship or contact, go out to our website. We do have a form out there where you can sign up for a year-end planning conversation. And I think that's the theme of today. With all of this uncertainty, that is just really important to do this year, to put a bow on everything. So we do have so much that we've covered today, and we have some questions that have been coming through the platform that we want to make sure we address live with our professionals while we're all together. So I want to start with a question that has come through related to the markets for Chris. Chris, this question relates to the fact that the markets seem to be performing well, and somebody wants to understand why that might be the case, given the fact that there's potential tax increases on the horizon. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, great question. And it's something we're looking at really closely. And I think at the core of it, since the markets, even before the election or even afterwards, they haven't changed much. But throughout this year, we're now up about 9% on the major indices. And that's really based on one word, which is stimulus. We've gotten central bank stimulus. So the Federal Reserve has lowered rates to zero, interest rates to zero. They have engaged in purchases of corporate bonds and municipal bonds and high yield bonds. And so there's lots of stimulus having been done. There's also
Sorry, we had a quick technical glitch and we're back.
So, just to kind of finish up, the exuberance in the market that we're seeing is really a function of more expected stimulus. But the one thing I would mention that even though we expect some more fiscal stimulus, the we see that our investors are still very nervous about valuations. And so they're taking money off the table on those areas of the market that seem kind of expensive, and they're putting them into cheaper areas. And one of the things you saw this week was one of the biggest rotations between growth stocks to value stocks in record. Simply put, investors are buying cheap value stocks because they're concerned about these valuations. Going into next year, we expect more stimulus, but we think investors will continue to look under the hood for cheaper areas to invest in.
That's great insights, Chris. Kind of sticking with the tax theme for 1 second, I'd like to ask Chastity a question. And while this one was fairly targeted, I'm going to bring it up to a higher level here. So this was specific to triggering capital gains in the context of a micro captive insurance. But really, if we pull it up here, the question is about income acceleration here, and people asking the question, should I accelerate income or defer deductions because I'm worried about rates going up? And Chastity, I told you I've personally been getting this question a lot. You and I talked a little bit about the fact that we've got to wait for the Senate races. What insights can you give into this here?
Yeah, Leslie, and I think my answer will probably be, not satisfactory for some, but it's the right answer, right? And that is, it really is going to depend on your individual situation. So I saw that question on there, but you can't just look at capital gains in isolation. You have to look at your entire financial footprint, tax footprint, to say, does that make sense compared to everything else that's going on in my tax return? So it's really hard in this setting to say, yeah, you should go ahead and accelerate gains just in case it goes up, because it's so individualized to each person's tax situation. And again, looking at it, globally, not just in piecemeal, should I accelerate capital gains?
I mean, I think that's a great answer and an appropriate response, Chastity. The interplay of that can be very complicated and complex. So I think that's a fantastic insight. I do want to also ask Rick a question. So Rick, you talked about the new forms that are out there, the 3509 and the 3510, and we've got a specific question related to aggregation. So if somebody has multiple franchise operations and none of those are over 2 million individually, but when you aggregate everything together, they now go over that $2 million mark, do they receive a 3509?
It's a great question. I'll maybe give two sides of the story here just to paint the full picture. The one is, if you take a look at the form instructions themselves, it does say it's intended for loans 2 million and greater, including affiliate loans. So the SBA for PPP has specific affiliation rules that they refer to with that. The challenge, and this is kind of the other side of it, and this is a huge topic on the lender side, is that is really difficult from a practical standpoint, especially considering how these loans might have been issued. You could have multiple lenders issuing loans for an affiliated group. There's also the question of, do you fill out the form at the affiliated group level or for individual entities? There's a lot of detailed questions that lenders aren't sure how to answer. So I would defer to a specific lender. I think, first of all, it's important to remember your obligation doesn't start until the lender gives you the form. If they give you the form and your loans for your affiliated group exceed that, you need to fill it out. I don't think you really have an option to wait. But I think it's worth asking them now what their position might be and how they see this so that you can better prepare for it. In the meantime, we'll hope that the lenders win in some of the fighting behind the scenes that's taking place right now.
Well, I really appreciate all of your insights, and unfortunately, that is all the time that we have for today. I want to thank our speakers, our moderators who have been live with us in the chat today, and all of our audience for their engagement and questions. We do encourage you to register and engage with us. We love having you be part of the conversation with us. And again, please reach out to your CLA relationship or contact us to have a year-end planning conversation. You can go to our website and register for all of our planning webinars that are coming up. We look forward to seeing you next week, and we will continue to provide updates related to economic relief, election topics, and everything else that is going on. But until then, we encourage you to stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful day. Thank you.